Picture this. You're 12 years old, walking home from school, taking the same shortcut you always do. The air is still. The playground is empty. Then a scream breaks the silence. You follow the sound and find something shocking. A baby. Alone. Crying. No parent in sight. What would you do? Would you stand and wait? Would you call for help? Or would you do what this boy did? Take action? But here's the twist. Instead of being thanked for his bravery, he's immediately seen as a suspect. Not for what he did, but for who he is. Why are we so quick to judge? Why do people see a black boy running down the street with a white baby and assume the worst? This isn't just a story about a missing child. It's about a community forced to confront its own prejudices, a family torn apart by secrets, and a young boy fighting for the truth. And just when you think you know where this story is going, a shocking revelation changes everything. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, would you have done what Noah did? Now let's get started. Noah Carter kicked a stray pebble as he walked the familiar path through Henderson Park, his backpack heavy on his shoulders. The November air was crisp, the scent of damp leaves lingering as he listened to the occasional rustling of the trees. This shortcut was his daily escape from the noise of school, the clamor of crowded hallways, the whispered jokes he wasn't part of, the teachers' voices reminding him to apply himself. Here, at least, he could think. But today, the silence wasn't comforting. It was too quiet. Usually, younger kids ran across the playground, their laughter bouncing off the metal swings. Elderly couples fed birds by the dried-up fountain. Not today. Noah glanced around, frowning. The stillness made his skin prickle. Something was off. Then, just as he reached the bend near the old oak tree, he heard it. A cry. Faint, distant, and distressed. He froze. The sound sent an uneasy tremor through his chest. A baby? Noah turned his head, straining to pinpoint the direction. The wind carried the sound toward the playground. His fingers curled around his backpack straps as he took a cautious step forward. Hello. His voice was swallowed by the empty park. The cry came again, more desperate, and Noah ran toward it. As he jogged past the swings, Noah's eyes scanned the empty benches and the rusted jungle gym. The crying grew louder. Then he saw it. Near the edge of the playground, half hidden behind a bush, sat an abandoned stroller. Noah's breath caught. A baby, no older than a few months, squirmed inside, tiny fists waving in the air, face red from screaming. The infant's wispy blonde hair stuck to its damp forehead, and the thin, worn blanket wrapped around its small frame did little to protect against the cold air. Noah's heart pounded. He looked around, desperately searching for someone, anyone. A mother, a babysitter, someone. But the park remained eerily empty. Noah swallowed. Why was a baby here alone? Kneeling beside the stroller, he hesitated, unsure of what to do. Hey, little one, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He had never spoken to a baby before, but it felt like the right thing to do. The child's tiny face contorted, mouth opening in another wail. It's okay, he murmured, glancing over his shoulder again. I'm gonna help, okay? The wind stirred the branches above, but no one appeared. The baby's sobs racked its tiny body, and Noah clenched his jaw. He couldn't just leave the child here. Noah's fingers hovered over the stroller handle. His mother had told him stories before, about babies left in desperate situations, about parents who made choices no one understood. She worked at Central Hospital and sometimes came home with heavy eyes, shaking her head at the cruel ways the world treated children. Was this one of those moments? Noah took a deep breath and reached down, gently adjusting the baby's blanket. The tiny hand that peeked through its folds gripped his finger tightly. A lump formed in his throat. He called out one last time. Hello? Is anyone here? Silence. Noah exhaled shakily. The baby couldn't stay out in the cold. It needed help. He glanced down the park's winding path. The hospital was only a few blocks away. His mother always said that when you didn't know what to do, taking someone to get help was always the best choice. Decision made. He gripped the stroller and started walking. The wheels of the stroller squeaked as Noah pushed it onto the sidewalk. His mind raced. Who leaves a baby in a park? Had someone been watching him? Would they come running, accusing him of something terrible? He shook the thought away and focused on each step. The baby let out a small whimper, and Noah quickly glanced down. Shoo, it's okay, he whispered, trying to remember how his mother calmed babies when she worked in the nursery. He hummed softly, an old song his mother used to sing. The baby's cries softened. "Yes, see? We're almost there," he murmured. He had no idea what was waiting for him at the hospital. But he was sure of one thing. He had to get the baby there safely. As Noah pushed the stroller down the main road, people noticed. Drivers in their cars slowed. Some turned their heads, eyebrows raised. A woman walking her dog paused, her gaze lingering before she quickly looked away. Noah's stomach twisted. He could feel their stares. He tightened his grip on the stroller. A black boy, a white baby. They were making assumptions. A black SUV slowed to a crawl. The woman inside narrowed her eyes, lips pursed in a thin line. Noah's throat tightened. "Keep walking," he muttered to himself, keeping his head down. A police car passed, and his heart nearly stopped. But it kept going. He exhaled, chest tightening with every second he was in public view. The hospital entrance was just up ahead. The bright red letters of emergency glowed against the setting sun. Almost there. A man coming out of the hospital lobby stopped mid-step, eyes locking on Noah. Noah forced himself to keep moving. A nurse at the front desk stood up, her mouth parting slightly. And then, just as he wheeled the stroller into the bright hospital lobby, the entire room went still. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had turned toward him. The receptionist's voice was sharp. "Excuse me, young man, what is going on here?" Noah's mouth went dry. The baby let out a tiny, exhausted whimper. And that was the moment everything changed. Noah's fingers tightened around the stroller handles as he stepped through the sliding glass doors of Central Hospital. The blast of air conditioning hit his damp skin, sending a shiver down his spine. He could still feel the heat of the stares from the people outside, their suspicious eyes burning into his back. The hospital lobby, normally filled with the steady hum of conversation, grew eerily quiet as he entered. A woman clutching her purse pulled it closer. A man in a business suit lowered his newspaper, watching. The receptionist behind the front desk, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on her nose, straightened in her chair. Noah felt his chest tighten. Why is everyone looking at me like that? His throat was dry, but he forced his voice to stay steady. I need help," he said, stepping closer to the desk. I found this baby." The receptionist's eyes flickered to the stroller, then back to Noah. Her expression hardened. "And where, exactly, did you find this baby?" she asked, her voice sharp, her hands frozen over her keyboard. "In Henderson Park," Noah answered quickly. "She was alone. I didn't know what else to do, so I brought her here." The receptionist's lips pressed into a thin line. "And you didn't think to call the police?" Noah shifted on his feet. "I don't have a phone," he admitted. The woman's gaze lingered on him, skepticism clear in her narrowed eyes. "Stay right here," she said before turning and whispering something to the nurse behind her. Noah's stomach twisted. Why does this feel wrong? The baby let out a soft whimper, and instinctively, Noah reached down and adjusted her blanket. He didn't know much about babies, but he knew that if he were cold and scared, he'd want someone to comfort him. A nurse in blue scrubs hurried toward them, her face etched with concern. But as she took in the sight before her, a black boy with a white baby, her eyes darkened with something else. "Where are the parents?" she demanded. "I don't know," Noah answered, shifting nervously. "She was just there." The nurse glanced at the receptionist, then at the baby. "We need to take her back for an exam," the nurse said. She reached for the stroller, her movements brisk, professional. Noah hesitated before letting go of the handles. As the nurse wheeled the baby away, he felt an odd emptiness settle in his chest. He had done the right thing. So why did it feel so wrong? Noah barely had time to process the unease creeping up his spine before the receptionist fixed him with another cold stare. "You need to stay here," she said. "Am I in trouble?" Noah asked cautiously. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she picked up the phone and murmured something too low for him to hear. Noah clenched his fists. He wasn't stupid. He knew that look. The same one the corner store owner gave him whenever he walked in alone. The one teachers sometimes had when they assumed he was up to something. The feeling settled like a weight in his stomach. A man in a white coat emerged from a nearby hallway. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses made him look important. His gaze flicked to Noah, then to the receptionist. "This is the boy?" he asked. "Yes, Dr. Reynolds," the receptionist replied. Dr. Reynolds' gaze settled on Noah, his expression unreadable. "Come with me," he said. Noah hesitated. Why did he feel like he was about to be interrogated instead of thanked? Dr. Reynolds led Noah down the hall toward a quiet examination room. Inside, two nurses hovered over the baby, who was now swaddled in a fresh hospital blanket. The crying had stopped, and she was making tiny cooing sounds, her small hands grasping at the air. Noah felt a rush of relief. At least she was okay. One of the nurses glanced at him before whispering something to the other. Dr. Reynolds turned to Noah. "You found her in the park?" "Yes, sir," Noah said. "She was alone. I didn't see anyone else around." The doctor crossed his arms. "And you just decided to bring her here?" Noah frowned. I thought that's what I was supposed to do." Dr. Reynolds studied him for a long moment. "And you're sure there was no one else?" Noah's patience was wearing thin. "I already told you. She was just sitting there in a stroller," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I couldn't just leave her." Dr. Reynolds didn't react. Instead, he turned to one of the nurses. "Have security come down here," he murmured. Noah's heart dropped. Security. The word made Noah's pulse spike. His fists clenched at his sides. "You think I took her?" he realized aloud, his voice shaking. "You think We have to be thorough," Dr. Reynolds said smoothly. "A baby doesn't just end up alone in a park." Noah stared at him. "So what? You think I did something to her?" His voice cracked. The nurse standing by the baby looked away. They didn't say yes, but they didn't say no, either. Noah felt his chest tighten. Everything he had done, every step he had taken to make sure this baby was safe. And this was what they thought of him? Before he could argue, the door swung open. And that's when everything changed. An older woman stepped into the room, her white coat pristine, her presence commanding. She was tall, with neatly styled silver hair and piercing blue eyes that swept across the room. But the moment her gaze landed on the baby, everything about her changed. The clipboard slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor. Her breath hitched. Her eyes filled with tears. "Oh my God," she whispered. The room fell silent. Dr. Reynolds frowned. "Dr. Monroe, what?" But she was already stepping forward, her trembling hands reaching for the baby. "Lillian," she choked out. The name hung in the air. Noah blinked. The baby had a name. And this woman, this powerful doctor, knew it. Dr. Monroe turned to Noah, her expression shifting from shock to something more intense. "Where did you find her?" she demanded. Noah swallowed hard. "Henderson Park." Dr. Monroe's face crumpled. "We've been looking everywhere," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. Dr. Reynolds stiffened. "This is your granddaughter?" Dr. Monroe nodded. Noah felt his breath catch. The baby wasn't just lost. She had been missing. And now it wasn't just the hospital staff looking at him like a suspect. It was the baby's family. Noah sat in the small waiting area just outside the emergency room, his hands clasped tightly together. He could still hear the baby's soft whimpers in the distance, now muffled by the flurry of nurses tending to her. His heart pounded with an unease he couldn't shake. The way they had looked at him, the questions, the whispers. He thought he was helping. So why did it feel like he was on trial? The doors to the ER swung open, and two uniformed police officers strode in. Noah's stomach clenched. A tall officer with graying hair at his temples approached the reception desk. His partner, younger and stiff in posture, trailed behind. "Where's the boy?" the older officer asked. The receptionist tilted her head in Noah's direction. Noah's pulse spiked. The older officer stepped toward him, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Son, I'm Officer Martinez. This is Officer Collins. We need to ask you a few questions." Noah swallowed hard. I already told them what happened." Martinez nodded, his expression unreadable. "We need to hear it from you directly." Noah shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the hospital staff. The receptionist was watching closely, arms folded. A nurse whispered something to her colleague, eyes flickering between Noah and the officers. "They think I did something wrong." "Stand up," Officer Collins instructed. Noah hesitated. "Am I in trouble?" "We just need to get the full story," Martinez said, voice even. "Come on, kid." Slowly, Noah stood, the heavy weight of their eyes pressing against him. Before Noah could say another word, the emergency room doors flew open. A man stormed inside, broad-shouldered, blonde hair slightly disheveled, piercing blue eyes burning with panic and fury. Lucas Monroe. Noah recognized him instantly from local news features. CEO, wealthy, untouchable. But right now, he was just a father whose child had been missing. "Where is she?" Lucas demanded, voice sharp. Dr. Monroe, his mother, was right behind him, her hands trembling. "She's safe," Dr. Monroe said quickly. "The nurses are checking her now." Lucas's eyes darted around the room until they landed on Noah. And then, something dangerous shifted in his expression. He strode toward Noah, jaw clenched, shoulders squared. "This is the kid who had my daughter?" Lucas's voice was like ice. Noah felt his breath catch. "Mr. Monroe," Officer Martinez warned. "We're handling it." Lucas ignored him. "You expect me to believe you just found my daughter sitting alone in a park?" I did," Noah said, his voice small but desperate. "She was in a stroller, all by herself." Lucas took a step closer, eyes dark with suspicion. "What were you doing in that park?" "I was," Noah faltered, suddenly acutely aware of how he looked. His hoodie was worn, his sneakers scuffed. His skin was not the same as theirs. Lucas's gaze hardened. "Did you take her?" Noah's breath hitched. Dr. Monroe stepped forward sharply. "Lucas, stop. We don't have all the facts." Lucas barely glanced at her. "My daughter is 6 months old," he seethed. "And this kid just happens to be the one who rescues her? I want answers. Now." Officer Collins shifted, placing a firm hand on Lucas's arm. "Sir, let us handle this." Lucas yanked his arm free. "What do you mean handle this? You're questioning him like a witness. He's a suspect." Noah felt the air squeeze out of his lungs. "Excuse me." A sharp voice cut through the tense air. The room turned. A woman stood at the entrance, back straight, eyes burning with fury. Angela Carter. Noah had never been so relieved to see his mother in his life. She moved like a force of nature, her nursing scrubs still on, her hair pulled into a neat bun. Her gaze sliced through the officers before landing on Lucas. "Who do you think you are, speaking to my son like that?" Lucas opened his mouth, but Angela didn't give him the chance. "You think my 12-year-old, my child, took your baby?" she said, voice dripping with incredulity. "Do you hear yourself?" Lucas's hands clenched into fists. You should be thanking him," Angela snapped. "If he hadn't found her, God only knows what would have happened." Lucas's nostrils flared, but for the first time, he hesitated. Officer Martinez cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, we need to." Angela turned to him next, her eyes fierce. "No, what you need to do is stop treating my son like a criminal," she said. "He saw a baby alone and did what any decent person should have done. But instead of listening to him, you're treating him like he's guilty." Noah looked down at his shoes. Angela's voice softened. She reached for him, resting a protective hand on his shoulder. "Baby," she said gently, "tell them exactly what happened." Noah took a deep breath and spoke. By the time Noah finished his story, the tension in the room hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. Lucas still didn't look convinced. But Dr. Monroe was watching Noah closely, something unreadable in her expression. "I want to see security footage," Lucas said, crossing his arms. Officer Collins nodded. "We're already checking surveillance from the park." A nurse, who had been silent until now, suddenly perked up. "Wait, I saw something," she said, eyes widening. Everyone turned toward her. The nurse bit her lip, thinking. "I was on my lunch break in Henderson Park earlier today. I saw a woman in a blue uniform, a nanny's uniform. She was pushing a stroller and pacing on the phone. She looked distressed." Lucas stiffened. "A nanny?" Dr. Monroe echoed. The nurse nodded. She kept glancing around, like she was nervous. "Then I left. I didn't think much of it." Noah felt his heart race. So someone had left the baby there. Lucas shot a look at Officer Martinez. "Find out who this woman is." "We're on it," Martinez said, pulling out his radio. Noah swallowed hard. But the weight of Lucas's suspicion hadn't fully lifted. After another round of questioning, Officer Martinez sighed and looked at Noah. "You're free to go," he said. Noah's shoulders sagged in relief. Angela exhaled sharply, then turned to Lucas, eyes hard. "You owe my son an apology." Lucas's jaw twitched. He said nothing. Angela scoffed. "Of course." She put a hand on Noah's back, guiding him toward the exit. But just as they reached the doors, Lucas's voice rang out. "This isn't over." Angela didn't turn around. Noah kept walking. But deep down, he knew Lucas was right. This wasn't over. Not even close. Dr. Evelyn Monroe sat at her desk, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. The hospital was quieter now, the chaos of earlier having faded into the rhythm of the night shift. But inside her mind, the storm raged on. She had spent decades compartmentalizing her emotions, focusing on logic, reason, and science. It was what made her an exceptional doctor. But today, logic had failed her. The moment she saw Lillian, she broke. The way the baby had clung to that boy's hoodie, the way he had protected her, walked miles to bring her to safety. She should have thanked him. Instead, her son, her stubborn, angry son, had treated the boy like a criminal. And deep down, Evelyn knew Lucas's reaction wasn't just about fear. It was about something uglier. Evelyn took a slow breath and typed into the hospital database. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. A distraction? An explanation? And then, her fingers froze. A familiar name popped up on the screen. Angela Carter. Her stomach clenched as she clicked on the file. The details loaded slowly, but Evelyn didn't need them. She already knew who Angela Carter was. And suddenly, the past came rushing back. Decades ago, before she was Dr. Monroe, before she had a grand estate or the influence she wielded now, she had been Evelyn Harper, the daughter of a prestigious Southern family. Her parents had been known for their wealth, their social standing, and their unyielding beliefs. And one rainy night, a desperate woman had banged on their door. Evelyn remembered it too well. A black woman, thin, tired, pregnant, stood in the downpour, pleading for help. "My baby," she had gasped, one hand cradling her swollen belly, the other gripping her young daughter's hand. "Please, I think something's wrong." Evelyn had been young then, barely an intern in medical school. She had wanted to help. She tried to help, but her father had stood in the doorway, unmoving. "She needs a hospital," he had said coldly. "We don't take people like her in our home." Evelyn had watched the woman's face crumble. She had watched the little girl, Angela, she realized now, clutch her mother's leg, watching, listening, learning. And then, her father shut the door. Evelyn never saw them again. But she later heard the whispers. The tragedy. The woman hadn't made it to the hospital in time. She died giving birth. Evelyn's stomach twisted. She closed the file, her hands clammy. Angela Carter wasn't just any woman. She was the child from that night. And now, decades later, Angela's son had saved her granddaughter. Fate was not without a sense of irony. Angela Carter sat in the worn armchair of their apartment, her hands still shaking. Her son was home, safe. But what had happened at that hospital wouldn't leave her mind. The way they had looked at Noah, the way Lucas Monroe had nearly lunged at him. She exhaled slowly and reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the one she hadn't used in years. A friend who still worked in hospital administration. She texted, "Can you find out who the head doctor was that night? The one who came in after Noah?" The reply came fast. Dr. Evelyn Monroe. Angela felt a sharp sting in her chest. That name. She knew that name. She had spent her childhood hating that name. Her mother had begged for help, and that family had turned her away. And now here they were. Dr. Monroe, wealthy and powerful. Angela, still fighting to be heard. And Noah, caught in the middle of history repeating itself. Her hands clenched into fists. She wasn't a helpless little girl anymore. She wouldn't let anyone hurt her son. Meanwhile, Lucas Monroe sat in his office, staring at the open case file in front of him. The police report on Noah Carter. Officially, they had no evidence that the boy had done anything wrong. The surveillance footage backed his story. Noah had indeed found Lillian alone in the park. But Lucas's trust had already been broken. His daughter had been taken from her home, and he wasn't ready to just let that go. He picked up his phone. "Detective Shaw," he said when the officer answered. "I want to know everything about that kid. His family, his history. If there's even a hint of something off, I want to know." A pause. "Lucas," Detective Shaw said carefully, "the boy isn't a suspect. And frankly, given the circumstances, maybe you should reconsider." Lucas's jaw tightened. "I don't reconsider when it comes to my daughter," he snapped. He hung up the phone. Noah Carter was hiding something, and Lucas Monroe was going to find out what it was. That night, as Noah lay in bed, he watched the rain patter against the window. His mother had tried to act normal when she got home, but he knew her too well. He saw the way her hands shook when she set the dinner plates down, the way she hugged him just a little longer than usual. They were still fighting a battle, and something told him it wasn't over yet. A loud crack of thunder echoed outside. Then, sirens. Noah sat up, confused. He peeked through the blinds. Down the street, a flash of water reflected against streetlights. Then another. A wave of realization hit him. The river was flooding. Before he could say a word, his mother appeared in the doorway, phone pressed to her ear. "Get your shoes on," she said quickly. "Now." Noah's stomach clenched. They had survived storms before, but this one felt different. Within minutes, they were in the car, navigating through the streets as emergency broadcasts crackled over the radio. "People are being evacuated to the community center," his mother muttered, her hands gripping the wheel. Noah's heart pounded. They were losing their home. But as they pulled up to the community center, as the rain hammered against the windshield, as they stepped into the crowded, chaotic shelter, he realized this storm wasn't just outside. It was inside them, too, and it wasn't going to pass anytime soon. The rain had been steady all evening, a dull, rhythmic tapping against the apartment windows. At first, it had been easy to ignore, just another storm in the middle of a long, exhausting week. Then came the sirens. Noah sat up in bed as a shrill warning blared through the city streets, cutting through the night air like a scream. His mother, Angela, stood at the window, her silhouette stiff with tension. "Mom." Noah's voice was groggy, still tangled in sleep. Angela turned, her expression already set in practical determination. "We have to go, baby," she said, grabbing her phone from the charger. "They're evacuating the block. The river's flooding." Noah's stomach clenched. Flooding. He scrambled out of bed, already hearing the sounds of movement outside. The distant murmur of voices, car doors slamming, hurried footsteps splashing through forming puddles. Angela threw open their emergency bag, the one she always kept ready for moments like this. She tossed in a few extra clothes, her nursing credentials, and the envelope of important documents she never let out of her sight. Noah stuffed his sneakers on, grabbing his backpack on instinct. He had no idea what he was packing for, only that this felt different than other storms. A loud knock at the door made them both jump. "Miss Carter." It was their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, standing in the hallway with her cat clutched against her chest. Her eyes were wide with fear. "They say the water's already reached the next block," she whispered. Angela nodded briskly. "We're heading to the community center. You coming?" Mrs. Jenkins hesitated before nodding. Yes, I think I should." Angela squeezed her shoulder, then looked down at Noah. "Let's move." With that, they stepped into the night, not knowing if they would have a home to come back to. The community center was overflowing with evacuees, the gymnasium lined with makeshift cots, families huddled together beneath blankets. The air smelled like damp clothes and lukewarm coffee. Noah sat with his knees pulled to his chest, trying to block out the noise. Angela had managed to get a corner spot for them and had just settled Mrs. Jenkins into a chair when she saw her. Dr. Monroe. She stood just inside the entrance, a pristine coat wrapped around her shoulders, her silver hair still neatly pinned in place despite the storm raging outside. Angela's stomach twisted. Noah followed his mother's gaze, his shoulders tensing the moment he saw the doctor. Dr. Monroe hesitated, then approached. "I heard about the evacuations," she said, her voice measured. Angela crossed her arms. "Came to check on us?" Dr. Monroe sighed. "I came to offer you a place to stay." Angela blinked, momentarily stunned into silence. "What?" Dr. Monroe cleared her throat. "My home has more than enough space. And given that your apartment complex is in a flood zone." She exhaled, rubbing her temple. "It's the least I can do." Angela studied her carefully. "Is this out of guilt?" she asked bluntly. Dr. Monroe flinched, just slightly. "No," she said. "It's because it's the right thing to do." Noah looked up at his mother, hope flickering in his eyes. The shelter was loud, crowded, chaotic. The thought of a warm bed, a place where they wouldn't be watched like they didn't belong, was tempting. Angela hesitated. Then she nodded. "All right," she said. "But this doesn't change anything." Dr. Monroe didn't argue. And just like that, they stepped into unfamiliar territory. The Monroe estate was the opposite of everything Noah had ever known. The driveway alone was longer than his entire apartment complex. The front door loomed, a grand wooden entrance with iron detailing, the kind of thing Noah had only seen in movies. As they stepped inside, the contrast was even more jarring. Everything was spotless, the air thick with the scent of lavender and expensive furniture polish. Family portraits lined the walls, each frame perfectly placed. Angela carried their single duffel bag, a sharp contrast to the wealth around them. Noah felt small. And then, Lucas Monroe appeared. He stood at the top of the staircase, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone flat. Dr. Monroe met his gaze evenly. "They're staying here," she said simply. Lucas's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered toward Angela, then Noah. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Dinner was awkward. Noah sat across from Lucas, picking at his plate, hyper-aware of every movement. Lucas barely spoke. When he did, it was clipped, polite, but cold. Angela, meanwhile, held herself with the same quiet strength she always did, meeting Lucas's subtle disapproval with an unshaken resolve. Dr. Monroe did her best to bridge the silence, but the tension was too thick. At one point, Lucas finally spoke directly to Noah. "How old are you?" Noah hesitated. 12. Lucas nodded slowly. "You have a phone?" "No." Lucas's brow furrowed. "Why not?" Noah shrugged. "My mom says I don't need one yet." Lucas hummed in response, then went back to his food. Angela set her fork down. "Is there something you want to say, Lucas?" Lucas glanced up, a faint smirk playing at his lips. "No, just making conversation." Angela narrowed her eyes. Noah wished he could disappear. Later that night, Noah stood by the window, watching the storm outside. He felt uneasy. His mother was lying on the bed in the guest room, exhausted but alert, her body coiled for a fight she knew was coming. "I don't like him," Noah admitted. Angela sighed. "I don't either." Noah hesitated. "Why'd we come here then?" Angela turned toward him, her gaze soft but firm. "Because sometimes, baby, you walk into uncomfortable places, not because you want to, but because it's the only way forward." Noah swallowed. The rain drummed against the window pane. They weren't in danger anymore. But the real storm had only just begun. Noah woke up early, the unfamiliar weight of the soft sheets wrapped around him. The Monroe estate was too quiet. At home, the mornings were filled with the hum of his mom making coffee, the sound of neighbors in the hallway, the occasional car horn outside their window. Here, everything felt still, like a museum. He sat up and rubbed his eyes. His mother was still asleep on the other side of the large guest room. She had barely slept since they arrived. Too much on her mind, too much history in this house. Noah slid out of bed, careful not to wake her, and padded down the long, polished hallway. The house felt like a place not meant to be lived in. Too neat, too staged. But as he made his way toward the kitchen, he caught a glimpse of something different. Lillian was in the living room, sitting in her playpen, her tiny hands gripping the edges as she babbled to herself. Her bright blue eyes lit up when she saw him. Noah hesitated, then stepped forward. "Hey there, little one." Lillian giggled, reaching for him. Noah crouched down, gently picking up one of her toys and handing it to her. She clutched it with tiny fingers, watching him curiously. "You don't think I'm scary, huh?" he whispered. Lillian gurgled in response, offering him her stuffed elephant. Noah smiled. Neither of them noticed Lucas standing in the doorway, watching. Lucas had woken up earlier than usual, unable to shake his unease. Having Angela and Noah in his house felt like an invasion, no matter how much his mother insisted it was necessary. But now, as he stood there, watching Noah kneel beside his daughter, gently entertaining her with soft smiles and quiet words, something shifted. This wasn't a boy with bad intentions. This was just a kid. A kid who had found his daughter when she needed help. A kid who had brought her home. Lucas cleared his throat, stepping forward. "She likes you." Noah jumped, turning around quickly. Lucas watched as he straightened his back, eyes wary. Yeah," Noah said. "She's cool." Lucas folded his arms. "You ever babysit before?" Noah shook his head. "No, sir. My mom takes care of people for a living. I guess I picked up some things from her." Lucas hummed. He didn't know what else to say. So instead, he just watched as his daughter laughed in Noah's presence, happier than she had been in days. Meanwhile, Angela sat across from Dr. Monroe in the sunlit sitting room, her fingers tightly clasped around her coffee mug. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Angela finally spoke. "You knew, didn't you? The moment you saw me." Dr. Monroe exhaled slowly, nodding. "Yes." Angela's grip tightened. "You were there when my mother begged for help." Dr. Monroe's eyes fell shut for a moment. "I was. And I failed her." Angela's throat tightened. She had spent years pushing that memory down, burying the pain of it. But now, face to face with the woman who had been on the other side of that closed door, it all felt raw again. "My mother died because of what your family did." Dr. Monroe looked up at her, eyes filled with regret. "I know." Angela wanted to yell, to say something that would make the weight in her chest disappear. But instead, she whispered, "Why now?" Dr. Monroe sighed. Because I can't change the past. But I can try to make things right now. Angela shook her head. Right for who? My son. He was innocent, and your son treated him like a criminal. And I had to sit there and watch, knowing this wasn't the first time your family had tried to take something from mine. Dr. Monroe winced. I know, she said quietly. That's why I need to do better. Angela swallowed hard. Forgiveness wasn't easy, and she wasn't sure she was ready. That afternoon, Lucas was struggling under the kitchen sink, cursing softly as water dripped down onto the floor. Noah hesitated at the doorway. Need help? Lucas glanced at him, about to say no, but then he sighed. You know anything about plumbing? Noah grinned. A little. He walked over, rolling up his sleeves. Pass me that wrench, Lucas muttered. Noah handed it to him, watching closely. I used to fix stuff with my grandpa, he explained. We didn't have money to call a plumber, so we figured it out ourselves. Lucas nodded, tightening the pipe. Smart. For the first time, their conversation didn't feel like an interrogation. It felt normal. After a few minutes, the leak stopped. Lucas wiped his hands on a rag. Good work. Noah beamed. And for the first time since they arrived, Lucas actually smiled back. That evening, Lucas stood outside on the back porch, staring at the fading sky. He heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he found Angela standing there, her arms crossed. Lucas exhaled. I judged your son unfairly. Angela tilted her head. Yes, you did. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck. I was scared, and I let that fear turn into something ugly. Angela didn't say anything. Lucas looked her in the eye. But I see him now. I see what kind of kid he is. And I was wrong. Angela studied him carefully. Then, after a long moment, she nodded. Good, she said. Now do something about it. Lucas smiled just a little. He would. Because for the first time in his life, he wanted to make things right. The morning air was crisp as Lucas Monroe stood outside on the back patio, his hands clasped tightly together. He had rehearsed the words over and over in his head, but now that the moment had arrived, he wasn't sure where to begin. Angela Carter sat on the opposite side of the patio table, her face unreadable, her posture stiff but composed. Noah stood beside her, watching him with cautious eyes. Lucas took a deep breath. I was wrong. Angela didn't react. He exhaled sharply and continued. I misjudged you, both of you, and I let my own fears, my own prejudices, blind me to the truth. Noah shifted slightly, but he didn't speak. Lucas swallowed hard. I saw you, Noah, and I assumed the worst. I didn't stop to think about what you must have felt that day. How scared you must have been, how determined you were to do the right thing. I treated you like a suspect when I should have treated you like a hero. A long silence stretched between them. Then, Noah finally spoke. I wasn't looking to be a hero, he said softly. I just wanted to help. Lucas nodded, his throat tightening. And that's what makes you one. Angela studied Lucas for a long moment before she sighed. You hurt my son. Lucas met her gaze, guilt settling deep in his chest. I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I promise I'll do better. I want to make this right. Angela exhaled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Then prove it. Lucas nodded firmly. I will. Noah looked up at his mother, and after a moment, he offered Lucas a small nod of his own. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The Monroe estate had never been so full of life. The backyard was decorated with twinkling lights, long tables filled with home-cooked food, and more people than Lucas had seen gathered in one place in years. The community had come together to celebrate Noah Carter, not as a suspect, but as the boy who had saved a life. Noah stood near the entrance, shifting awkwardly as people offered him handshakes, hugs, and words of gratitude. Mrs. Jenkins, their former neighbor from the flood zone, squeezed his hand. I always knew you were special, Noah. Dr. Monroe stepped up to the makeshift podium. Tonight, we recognize a young man who showed courage beyond his years, she began. When others might have walked away, Noah Carter stepped forward. He carried my granddaughter to safety, despite the whispers, despite the fear, despite the doubt cast upon him. And for that, my family will forever be in his debt. Applause filled the air. Noah's face burned with embarrassment and pride all at once. He glanced at his mother, who smiled at him, her eyes glistening. Lucas stepped forward next. He cleared his throat, looking directly at Noah. I owe you something, he said. More than just an apology. Noah's brows furrowed in confusion as Lucas, pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside was a brand new cell phone. "I know your mom wanted you to wait a little longer for this," Lucas admitted, glancing at Angela. "But I wanted you to have it, so that no one will ever doubt your voice again." Noah stared at the phone, his throat tightening. He looked up at his mom for permission. Angela nodded, pride shining in her eyes. Noah took the phone and murmured, "Thank you." Lucas smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. "No, Noah. Thank you." Over the next few weeks, things began to shift. The same neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with Angela now greeted her warmly at the grocery store. The same police officers who had once interrogated Noah now waved when they passed him on the street. The hospital staff who had doubted his story now spoke of him with admiration. And Lucas Monroe? He had begun to truly see the world differently. One evening, he found himself sitting across from Dr. Monroe in her study. "I was wrong for a long time," he admitted, swirling the whiskey in his glass. His mother studied him carefully. "And now," Lucas exhaled, "now, I want to be the kind of man Lillian can be proud of. The kind of man who sees people, really sees them." Dr. Monroe nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Then you're already on the right path." On one of their last nights at the Monroe estate, Angela found herself sitting on the back porch with Dr. Monroe. The two women had danced around their past long enough. Angela spoke first. "I can't pretend that what your family did didn't shape my life." Dr. Monroe swallowed. "I don't expect you to." Angela exhaled, staring at the darkened sky. "But I can recognize when someone is trying to be better." Dr. Monroe nodded. "I am, and I'll keep trying." For the first time since they had arrived, Angela let the past loosen its grip on her. Just a little. Noah and Angela stood outside their newly rebuilt apartment, bags in hand, ready to step back into the life they had nearly lost. Dr. Monroe had offered to let them stay permanently at the estate, but Angela had politely refused. "We're grateful," she had said, "but we need to go home." Lucas and Dr. Monroe stood nearby, watching as Angela unlocked the door. Before stepping inside, Noah turned back toward Lucas. "So, do I still need to check in with you before babysitting Lillian?" he teased. Lucas chuckled. "I suppose you've earned my trust." Noah smirked. "Took you long enough." Angela laughed, shaking her head. "Come on, kiddo." As they stepped inside, the door closed behind them, but something felt different this time. They weren't just returning home. They were stepping into a future where bridges had been built instead of burned. And that, Noah thought, was the real victory. At the heart of this story is a powerful question. How often do we judge someone before we really get to know them? Noah's journey reminds us that doing the right thing doesn't always bring immediate rewards, but it always matters. His story challenges us to reconsider our own assumptions, our own biases, and the impact our choices have on those around us. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment when someone was misjudged before the truth was revealed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. If this story moved, inspired, or made you think, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We bring you more thought-provoking stories that highlight real struggles, redemption, and the power of kindness. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and join us to discover the stories that deserve to be told. Let's keep the conversation going.